welcome back, everyone. So today's video is going to be part 5 in my series on Eschatology and the Doctrine of Eternal Torment. And I have a lot of things I'd like to get into today, so rather than spend too much time recapping the material in my previous videos, for those who haven't yet watched those, I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description. So today I want to talk about Jesus' second coming in Matthew 24, and why I believe there's been so much confusion and so many interpretations of this one chapter. So this will involve discussing some of those issues surrounding its interpretation, and I also want to offer a solution which I believe can make some sense out of all that confusion. So just a quick reminder of where we left off last time. In Matthew 23:33, Jesus warned the scribes and Pharisees by telling them, "Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell?" Or, literally, the judgment of Gehenna. And you may recall that in asking whether or not Jesus answered when that judgment of Gehenna would take place, how within the context of those words, Jesus plainly told the Pharisees, all of these things, and presumably that would include that judgment of Gehenna, shall come upon this generation. And I discussed the importance of how we understand that phrase, this generation, and how it appears that the most natural interpretation of those words is that they were signifying the time in which Jesus' warnings would be fulfilled. Then at the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, I pointed to that context, that after this confrontation with the Pharisees, Jesus departs from the temple. Jesus tells the disciples that the temple would be destroyed, and they ask him, "When shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming?" Or in the Greek, Parousia, and of the end of the world. And then I discussed how that question from the disciples in Matthew 24:3 is really two questions. One about when the temple would be destroyed, and a second question about Jesus' coming, or Parousia. Now, it's my belief that Jesus answers these two questions in a way which should clear up any confusion that would try to conflate these two things, the destruction of the temple and his Parousia. So today we're going to examine those answers from Jesus. And on this one, we're going to need to get down into the weeds a little bit and confront some difficult questions head on. So, in trying to show the distinction between the two prophetic horizons contained within Jesus' answer, one past and one still future, I already know that in order to try and make this video not too long, I'm not going to be able to get to everything I'd like today. So, while I know what I'm going to say in this video today is going to raise a lot of questions, legitimate questions, which I promise I will get to as we continue, for today, I just want to focus on something going on in Matthew 24 about these two prophetic horizons that's so obvious it may be easy to miss, but I feel it really is the key to understanding the entire chapter. And so the first thing I need to mention is that within this discussion today, I'm going to use that Greek word Parousia to refer to Jesus' future second coming. And I want to use that word for clarity because there are actually two words for the coming of Jesus within Matthew chapter 24. There's the Greek word Parousia, but the chapter also contains the Greek word erchomai, which has also been translated coming. And as we move forward, the distinction between these two different Greek words will become important. But for now, whenever I'm talking about Jesus' yet future coming, or as many think of it, his second coming, for the sake of accuracy and clarity, today I'm going to be using that word Parousia. So in Matthew 24:3, the disciples asked Jesus two questions. And the first question they asked was, "When shall these things be?" And the context of that question seems to demand that they were inquiring about when the temple would be destroyed. After all, it was Jesus' statement that the temple would be destroyed which prompted that question. And so the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, did Jesus actually answer that question? In the prophetic discourse that follows in the remainder of the chapter, did Jesus tell the disciples when they should expect the destruction of the temple? And a lot of people just read through the chapter and never really consider whether or not Jesus really ever answered this question of when. Now, from our vantage point, we have the advantage of history, and we do know precisely when Jesus' words about the destruction of the temple were fulfilled. Jesus spoke those words to his disciples in the early 30s AD, probably around the year 33. And it was in 66 AD that the Roman armies besieged Jerusalem, and in 70 AD the temple was destroyed, just as Jesus had predicted. So within the space of about 40 years, Jesus' prediction about the temple was exactly fulfilled. Or as we might say, Jesus' prediction was fulfilled within one single generation from the time when he spoke those words. And that's something we should immediately find interesting. Recall that warning from Jesus to the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23. He warned them of the judgment of Gehenna. He told them the blood of the prophets would be upon them. He told them their house was left to them desolate. And he said, all these things shall come upon this generation. So notice what we have here. We have Jesus' prediction that the temple would be destroyed, and we have the disciples' question of when that would happen. And we have Jesus' words concerning a specific generation. All of these things, he said, shall come upon this generation. And we have all this coupled with an undeniable fact of history, namely that the temple, the old order, the city of Jerusalem, and in fact the entire nation was destroyed and made desolate within one generation of when Jesus spoke those words. Now, Jesus' declaration about, quote, this generation is echoed in Matthew chapter 24, but arguably in an even stronger form. In Matthew 24:34, Jesus states, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. And notice those words, this generation shall not pass. And we're going to come back to this, but I'll just point out here that this seems to only strengthen an interpretation which understands that by this generation, Jesus was referring to a specific generation in time, his own generation. And it seems to me that it makes much more sense to understand a generation not passing as not passing in reference to time than it does to understand this to mean that a particular race or a group of people would not pass away. And again, just consider what's contained within that preceding context. The warning concerning the desolation of the nation, the prediction the temple would be destroyed, the disciples' question of when those things would happen, and the historical fact that all of those things did, in fact, take place within the space of one single generation from the time Jesus spoke those words. And if that's all we had here in Matthew chapters 23 through 24, then I don't think there'd be any question at all about what Jesus meant by this generation. Those words alone seem clear enough, and when taken together with the predicted judgments, along with their actual historical fulfillment, well, there wouldn't be much more to discuss. And I probably wouldn't be here talking to you today. History appears to provide us with a remarkable and precise fulfillment of Jesus' words about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, as well as a precise prediction of when those things would take place. Why would we ever even question what the correct interpretation could be for any of this? But things could never just be that easy, could they? And as it turns out, many do question, and in fact, many completely reject that Jesus' words about, quote, this generation have anything to do with those events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. And anyone who spent any time carefully considering the material in Matthew chapter 24, material which precedes that statement from Jesus, that this generation shall not pass till all be fulfilled, probably already knows why this is. It's because the intervening material in Matthew 24, mainly material in verses 15 through 33, seems to predict events, including the very second coming of Jesus, that certainly did not occur within that one generation after which Jesus spoke those words, that generation which witnessed the destruction of the temple and the nation. So the logic here seems perfectly sound, because if Jesus said, "This generation shall not pass until all these things are fulfilled," and those things include his second coming, then by this generation, it's reasoned, he simply could not have meant any generation that didn't include his second coming. Now, this reasoning appears to be perfectly sound, but it contains an assumption, and one I think that's almost become a blind spot for many believers. And I'm going to come back to that in just a bit, but let me first just say this. I've read literally dozens of commentaries on Matthew 24 from a broad range of perspectives. And believe me when I tell you that my own personal journey has evolved through many of those different perspectives. But nearly all of those commentaries which reject that by this generation, Jesus meant that particular generation to which he was speaking, well, nearly all of them admit that it does appear, at least at first, that that just is the most plain and natural understanding of those words. But then they go on to try to explain, while that's true, those words, this generation, need not demand a first century fulfillment. And then they go on to offer various ways around what at first appears to be a very thorny problem. And now, I just want to caution against that type of reasoning. The type that tells us, I know that this appears to clearly say X, but it can't really mean that because of this other thing I know to be true. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves whether or not that other thing we know to be true might contain a faulty or hidden assumption, which can turn out to be the true source of our difficulty. And really, while an alternate interpretation of this generation might relieve us of one potential difficulty, thinking that taking this generation literally results in a failed prophecy from Jesus about his second coming in the first century, really it only creates other difficulties. Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. The disciples ask when. Did Jesus ever answer that question about when the temple would be destroyed? Well, not if the phrase "this generation" has nothing whatsoever to do with the historical fact of when it actually was destroyed. Jesus predicted something. That something happened historically within one generation. But we're supposed to believe that Jesus' actual words about this generation have no real application to that generation when those things actually occurred. I mean, really, is it just a happy accident or coincidence that what many think is the wrong interpretation of Jesus' words, this generation, actually happens to coincide with historical fact? That just doesn't appear to make a whole lot of sense, at least not to me. So it's just not enough to say that by this generation, Jesus could not have meant what it plainly appears to mean, because in our minds that appears to result in a failed prediction. One needs to explain why the entire chapter should contain no answer to the disciples' question about when the temple would be destroyed. And an explanation is required as to why so much else, which was predicted, did take place during that generation, and why we think it's valid that his words about this generation have absolutely no connection to those events. It's very uncomfortable that the only reason Jesus' words about this generation should be given some alternate interpretation is because we fear we'd make a liar out of him if we didn't. But frankly, It just seems like a rather ad hoc way to go about interpreting Scripture. As C.S. Lewis put it, Matthew 24:34 is, quote, certainly the most embarrassing verse in the Bible. Well, I'm going to go in the opposite direction here and say that we have no reason to be embarrassed, and that we should take these words from Jesus in their plainest, most natural sense, even if that means we need to confront some difficult questions. So, where does that leave us? If Jesus' words, "This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled," are to be understood literally in their plainest sense, then it would seem that there's an enigma here concerning Jesus' second coming. But if we keep reading, there's something right there in the middle of the chapter, beginning in verse 36, and it begins with that really important word, but. This word but, starting at verse 36, introduces us to something that's easy to miss or to dismiss if we're not careful. So let's carefully consider what immediately follows Jesus' statement that this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. And beginning in verse 36, we read, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming," or Parousia, "of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. So also shall the coming," or Parousia, "of the Son of Man be." Now, remember, the disciples had asked Jesus two questions, one about when the temple would be destroyed, and the other about the Parousia and the end of the age. And we're just going to assume for a moment that we can take Jesus' words about this generation in their plainest, most natural sense, that he was speaking about that generation and the time when the temple would be destroyed. Jesus predicted it, the disciples asked when. Jesus says within one generation, and we have the historical fact that the temple was destroyed within that single generation. So in that way, we have a direct answer to the disciples' first question. Just allow that for now, that by this generation shall not pass, Jesus meant those words in their most natural sense. He directly answered the disciples' question and precisely predicted the time of when the temple would be destroyed. Well, if that's the case, then it should be clear that there's a jarring contrast with those words beginning right here in verse 36. Notice what Jesus says. He says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming," or Parousia, "of the Son of Man be." So notice this contrast. About the disciples' first question of when the temple would be destroyed, well, Jesus seems to have predicted and fixed the time of that fulfillment to within a single generation. But what about that second question, the question about Jesus' Parousia and the end of the age? Well, the question of when that would happen, and notice that context, that day and that hour are about Jesus' Parousia. Well, about that time, Jesus just does not know. Furthermore, he says that the angels don't know, and that only the Father knows. And that means that Jesus did not, and could not, answer the disciples' question about when his Parousia would happen. Which of course means the disciples didn't know, and therefore the writers of the New Testament didn't know. The time of the Parousia is not known. And I'll just note that this is something we need to remember when considering any passage about Jesus' Parousia that we might find in the New Testament. Now, Jesus applies the words, "this generation shall not pass," to a lot of different events in Matthew 24, 5 through 34. But the time of his Parousia is not one of them. The timing of the Parousia is a complete mystery. Now, I need to appeal to your common sense. Does it make any sense at all that in one breath Jesus would firmly fix the timing of one set of events to within one single generation, and in the next breath state that he knows nothing about when his coming or Parousia should take place, if in fact we were supposed to understand those events together? Either Jesus knows the timing of his Parousia or he does not. And it doesn't at all seem credible to try and blur this contrast, as some have tried to do by suggesting that while Jesus couldn't know the day or the hour of his Parousia, he could know the generation in which it would occur. And this is a problem for any interpretation, whether preterist or futurist, which tries to suggest that this generation of verse 34 includes or has anything to do with the timing of Jesus' Parousia. The timing of an event can't be both known within the space of one generation and at the same time unknown. In his commentary on the book of Matthew, R.T. France, who is also here quoting the author A.I. Wilson, writes the following. He says, "The suggestion sometimes offered that Jesus was prepared to speak in broad terms of the generation of the Parousia, but now admits that he cannot specify the precise time for it within that generation, is robustly dismissed as, quote, beyond the bounds of credibility by A.I. Wilson. Those who have nonetheless adopted this incredible interpretation have been governed more by their assumption that verses 29 through 31 are about the Parousia than by the wording of the discourse as a whole, which clearly now introduces a new and different day and hour, and contrasts the knowability of one with the unknowability of the other." Wilson goes on, quote, "It surely places unbearable strain on Matthew's credibility as a redactor and or on Jesus' credibility as a teacher to claim that Jesus is referring to the same event in verses 33 through 34 and in verse 36. And with those comments, I just couldn't agree more. So this is the key to the entire chapter. Something known about which the time is specified, explicitly contrasted with something that cannot be known. And this coincides with the disciples' two questions. First, when will the temple be destroyed? And second, what will be the sign of your Parousia? And when examined, all the confusion and the many interpretations that have arisen trying to interpret this chapter, all of it comes down to this one simple thing: confusing those things about which the time can be known with those things about which the time cannot be known. Now, our preterist friends will continually emphasize the literalness of the words, this generation, and will point out the problems with making that into some generation other than the one to whom Jesus spoke those words, or criticize any alternate interpretation of this generation. And in my view, their point here and their criticisms are completely valid. I think there are serious problems with trying to explain away the plain meaning of Jesus' words. Preterism is a system which is propped up by texts just like Matthew 24:34, verses they like to call time texts. But Matthew 24:36 is also a time text, a text in which we're explicitly told that the time of Jesus' Parousia is not and cannot be known. So this time text, in verse 36, is a problem for their entire system. They try to assert that Jesus' Parousia arrived within the same generation which witnessed the destruction of the temple. They attempt to ignore or blur the contrast between verses 34 and 36, between something known, the time of the destruction of the temple, and something which cannot be known, the time of the Parousia. So yes, preterists can legitimately consign a lot of things to one particular past generation, but Jesus' Parousia is not one of them. And then we have the futurists and even some historicists who attempt to get around the clear language of this generation by reasoning that if Jesus didn't know the time of his Parousia, then he was either specifying some future unknown generation, or that this generation isn't a reference to a specific period of time at all. Both of these systems, preterism and futurism, have missed what should be clear. The Parousia is not the subject of that generation at all, whatever it may be. They have either missed, ignored, or sought to blur the plain contrast between verses 34 and 36. Now, where does this all leave us? Well, two things seem to be plain. First, there are serious problems with trying to make Jesus' words about this generation into anything other than what they appear, a prediction about the specific generation which witnessed the destruction of the temple and the nation. Second, that if his words about this generation are a specific prediction of when certain events would take place, then his Parousia or coming is explicitly excluded from that prediction, simply because the time of his Parousia is not and cannot be known. Now, given those two things, what does that leave us with? Well, it still leaves us with an apparent problem, right there in the middle of Matthew 24, the material from verse 15 through verse 34. That material contains many familiar prophetic concepts and predictions, such as the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, the darkening of the sun and moon, the stars falling from heaven, and ultimately, Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And now, again, I just want to appeal to your sense of logic and reason. Two propositions. First, these things, the tribulation, Jesus coming on the clouds with power and glory, etc., are predicted in the context of those events about which Jesus said, "This generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled." But second, Jesus also stated that the time of his Parousia was not known. What is the logical conclusion of those two propositions? If the material in Matthew 24, 15 through 34 is confined to a known past generation, but Jesus doesn't know the timing of his Parousia, logically, what would be our conclusion? Well, the only logical conclusion would be that those things in Matthew 24, 15 through 34, the Great Tribulation, Jesus coming with power and great glory, etc., the logical conclusion would be that those things are not to be associated with Jesus' Parousia or second coming at all. In other words, those things do not constitute and are not describing a prediction about Jesus' second coming. And here's where we come to those numerous questions, difficulties, and perceived absurdities I mentioned in my previous video. Am I saying that the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation are in the past? Am I really suggesting that Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven with power and glory already happened? Well, the fact that those events appear to be confined to the generation which witnessed the destruction of the temple definitely raises a lot of questions. And all of those questions and concerns are important and valid, and they deserve a comprehensive discussion. But they're also questions that every Christian really needs to ponder, given the issues and the questions I've raised here. But I want to be clear about where I stand. Jesus is no failed prophet. Jesus is the infallible Son of God, and the very Word of truth made flesh. And if Jesus predicts something or interprets a prophecy, we can be certain those words are sure and true. And if we ever have any doubts, then the problem is with our own fallible understanding, and not with Jesus' words. And I believe that Jesus is coming again. I don't believe that his Parousia occurred in the past at the time the temple was destroyed in the 1st century. I believe that as Christians we should live every day in the hope and expectation of our Lord's coming and of his Parousia. And I believe that prophecy has a lot to say about Jesus' still future coming. So the question is not about whether or not Jesus is coming again. The only question is about the proper application of the material we find in Matthew 24, 5 through 34. Matthew 24 contains 2 questions, 2 answers, and 2 prophetic horizons. The destruction of the temple contrasted with the Parousia, one set of events which is past, and one which remains future and unfulfilled. The timing of one horizon was revealed. The timing of the second cannot be known. And all of these things can be determined from the plain meaning of Jesus' words. So in that respect, interpreting the chapter is in fact simple. But interpreting Matthew 24 is also hard, because the material which appears to be confined to that first known past horizon and generation has long been assumed to be a description of the second unknown and future horizon about Jesus' Parousia. So in the next video, we need to tackle that assumption and take a careful look at that material in the middle of Matthew 24 from verse 5 through 34, and those things usually associated with Jesus' second coming. The abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, the stars falling from heaven, Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and why it is that Jesus plainly tells us that those things would find their fulfillment within the space of his own generation. And I think there's a lot more going on in those verses than many believers may realize, and I hope to show that some of the problems people may be having with this idea aren't nearly as difficult or as absurd as they might at first appear, but are actually arising from some pretty entrenched assumptions. But as eager as I am to get into those details, in order to avoid making this video longer than it already is, I'm going to have to leave that for next time. So again, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's continued to watch. I told myself when I started this channel that if even one person found this material helpful, that it would be worth the time to do this. So the interest you've all shown has been a huge encouragement and a real blessing to me. So again, if you found this video interesting, I always appreciate a like. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing as well. So with that, and until next time, I'm David with the Harvest Herald, and I hope to talk to you all again real soon in the next video.